Understood and locked as story architecture constraint for all subsequent parts. Part 9 will be treated as a silence ending, not a plot ending. The entire story from Part 1 through Part 8 will now be engineered toward one restrained emotional reversal expressed through symbol and behavior, not explanation. The intended ending energy is not triumph, but quiet transformation. Alexander's arc will not culminate in confession or grand restitution, but in one small act that would have been impossible for the man in Part 1. A likely symbolic endpoint guiding all build-up. Near closing time, Claire places a coffee cup before him as she did in the beginning, but beside it lies the old Swiss watch she once wore, now repaired. Alexander does not speak. He removes the gold cufflinks that signaled power all story long, sets them aside, and answers her in careful Arabic, not perfectly, but sincerely. She does not smile at first. Only her eyes soften. Rain against the window. A receipt folded once. He leaves without asking her name again, because now he knows who she is. Then, after a beat, Claire turns the restaurant sign from open to closed and touches the cup he left untouched, still warm. That kind of ending will be prepared through every earlier beat. The language motif, the watch motif, the contract motif, his evolving gaze, her refusal to perform for admiration. All scenes will move naturally toward this still point. Show before feeling. Gesture before realization. Silence carrying what dialogue no longer needs to say. Final moral tone to aim toward. Dignity does not arrive when someone kneels before you, but when neither of you needs to stand above the other. That phrase belongs to a dead royal house, the waitress said softly, and the crystal in the billionaire's hand stopped moving. At first, no one at Marlowe House understood what had changed. The laughter still hung in the air. Silverware still chimed. Rain still threaded down the tall Manhattan windows in thin rivers of light. But something invisible had tilted. It had begun 30 seconds earlier, when Alexander Hayes leaned back in his private corner booth beneath the amber sconces, his voice carrying just enough for nearby diners to hear. "Serve me in Arabic and I'll buy this restaurant." He said it like a man tossing money at boredom. A few guests laughed politely. One of his associates smirked into a whiskey glass. Alexander was used to rooms bending around his amusement. At 38, worth more than most small nations, he had turned power into a kind of sport. And tonight, in the oldest private dining room on Fifth Avenue, he looked at the quiet blonde waitress with the same detached curiosity he might give a rare wine. Claire Whitmore did not react. She simply stood there holding a porcelain coffee cup on a silver tray, her white blouse crisp beneath the black apron, a small Swiss watch glinting at her wrist. She had served his table 3 times already without speaking more than necessary. That, more than anything, intrigued him. Most people performed around men like Alexander Hayes. She disappeared into stillness. "Well," he said, amused. "No Arabic." Claire lowered the cup before him. Her fingers brushed the saucer with almost ceremonial precision. Then she answered, not in modern conversational Arabic, but in a melodic, old-world dialect that made the elderly man seated 2 tables over slowly rise to his feet. The room seemed to inhale. Even Alexander, who understood enough Arabic to recognize elegance when he heard it, felt something cold and electric move through him. But it was what she said next in English, almost as an afterthought, that altered the air. That phrase belongs to a dead royal house. Silence. One investor frowned. Another set down his fork. Alexander studied her face for signs of mockery and found none. Only composure. Almost sorrow. "What did you just say?" he asked. Claire's eyes moved briefly to the folded contract near his hand, then back to him. "That your guest from Riyadh has been flattering you in a dialect his grandfather would have used at court." She nodded toward the older Arab gentleman who had now approached. "And that he has been testing whether anyone at this table can hear what is meant to be translated." The gentleman gave the faintest bow. "She is correct." Alexander felt, for the first time in years, the strange sensation of arriving late to his own conversation. His thumb tapped unconsciously against the gold rim of his watch. Claire turned as if to leave. "Wait," he said, sharper than intended.
She paused.
Rain pressed harder against the glass. "Where did you learn that dialect?" Her hand rested lightly over the old Swiss watch. From someone who taught me language can hide more than it reveals. Then she walked toward the service corridor, black flats silent on marble, leaving behind a billionaire, a stunned table, and a cup of coffee slowly cooling between untouched hands. Alexander did not lift it. He only watched the doorway where she had vanished, as though something older than money had just crossed the room in an apron. And somewhere beneath the chandelier glow, a game had ended before he realized he had lost it. Alexander Hayes did not sign the contract that night. For 20 minutes after Claire disappeared behind the service corridor, he let the fountain pen rest untouched beside the embossed papers while his investors exchanged puzzled glances. That had never happened before. Men like Alexander were known for deciding in seconds what others debated for months. Yet now his attention remained fixed on a coffee cup growing cold beneath chandelier light. The older Arab gentleman, Sheikh Rahim, watched him with a knowing calm. "You heard the words," the sheikh said at last. "But did you hear the warning?" Alexander looked up slowly. "What warning?" The old man slid one page of the contract toward him and tapped a clause buried near the bottom. "The language shifts here, from partnership to control." Alexander stared. The Arabic subclause he had skimmed over now seemed to breathe with hidden teeth. He had nearly signed away voting rights in a foreign expansion worth hundreds of millions. His jaw tightened, and she saw it in seconds. The sheikh smiled faintly. Some people read contracts. Others read intentions. That sentence stayed with him long after dinner ended. Outside, rain silvered Park Avenue. Black town cars lined the curb. Alexander should have gone uptown to his penthouse, but instead he stood under the restaurant awning watching through the glass as Claire moved between tables carrying coffee pots, clearing plates, vanishing and returning like a quiet rhythm the room relied upon without noticing. She did not look toward him once. That unsettled him more than admiration would have. At 1 a.m, unable to let it go, he asked the night manager a simple question. "How long has Claire worked here?" The man shrugged. 3 years. Keeps to herself. Never late. Reads in the break room. Reads what? Languages, I think. Strange alphabets. Alexander almost smiled. At 2:15, he was in his study on the 52nd floor. City lights spread beneath him like a second sky. Yet instead of reviewing markets, he opened an old cedar box he had not touched in years. Inside lay his father's fountain pen, a yellowed passport, and one photograph taken in Beirut decades earlier. A diplomatic reception. Men in white robes. A child barely visible near the edge beside an interpreter. Alexander narrowed his eyes. Something about the child's posture stirred recognition. Impossible, he told himself. Still, he set the photograph beside the contract and stared until dawn washed the windows pale blue. The next afternoon, he returned to Marlowe House without reservation. Not as billionaire patron. As a man pursuing an unanswered note. Claire was arranging porcelain cups behind the espresso station when she sensed him before seeing him. "You came back for the coffee," she said, not turning. "I came back for a translation." She lifted her eyes then, and there was the faintest hint of amusement. Those are rarely the same thing. He placed the contract on the counter between them. "Show me what I missed." She did not touch the papers immediately. Instead, she folded a receipt once, twice, as though measuring his request. Most powerful men do not return to ask where they were blind. Most powerful men, he said quietly, have not been corrected by a waitress. Claire finally opened the contract. Her fingers moved to the clause. "Words can bow," she said, "or they can kneel." Alexander watched the old Swiss watch at her wrist catch afternoon light. And which was this? Claire met his gaze. A trap disguised as respect. For the first time in years, Alexander Hayes listened without preparing his reply. And somewhere beneath the hiss of steam and the scent of dark roast, something almost imperceptible shifted, not in the contract, but in the man who had come back to have it read. 3 evenings later, Alexander stopped pretending his visits were about the contract. He arrived just after 7, always alone, always taking the same corner table beneath the amber lights where the rain painted silver lines down the windows. The staff began to notice. Men who owned private jets did not return repeatedly for coffee, they barely drank. Yet Alexander came, set aside his phone, and waited for Claire to approach as though the few measured words she offered carried a value markets could not price. That night she brought Turkish coffee instead of his usual espresso. "This was not what I ordered," he said, looking into the dark surface. "Neither was humility," she replied. There was the faintest shadow of a smile near her eyes. Alexander almost laughed. Almost. He had begun to understand humor could arrive without conquest. Claire placed a folded linen napkin beside the cup. A phrase written in Arabic script rested inside. "Read it." He traced the characters slowly. "Patience," he hesitated, "is the courtesy of kings." "Close," she said. "Courtesy of those who know power leaves." He looked up. "Was your father the one who taught you?" Claire did not answer at once. She turned a teaspoon once around the saucer, the silver ringing softly. "My father taught diplomats how to hear what was never spoken aloud. And you?" "I learned what silence protects." Her words lingered long after she stepped away to serve another table. Across the room, Alexander watched her greet an elderly couple in French, then answer a busboy in Spanish, without changing the calm rhythm of her voice. Hidden intelligence, he thought. No. Not hidden. Merely ignored. Later that night, when the dining room thinned and the city beyond the glass glowed blue-black, Claire returned carrying an old leather-bound book. She placed it beside his cup. Arabic poetry. Margins filled with notes in faded ink. "Whose is this?" he asked. "My father's." He opened to a marked page. A line was underlined twice. "The strong man raises his voice. The wise man lowers it." Alexander read it again. Something in his chest moved, almost like grief. "Why show me this?" Claire studied him carefully. "Because you came back." At that moment his phone vibrated. His chief counsel. Urgent. The Riyadh investors were demanding a response by midnight. Alexander looked at the screen, then turned the phone face down. For the first time in decades, he chose not to answer power calling. Claire noticed, though she said nothing. Instead, she pointed to a phrase in the margin. "Translate that." He struggled through the script. Mispronounced 2 words. She corrected neither. "It says," he frowned, sounding it out, "respect enters where pride leaves." Claire gave the slightest nod. "Better." A long silence followed. Not awkward. Full. The kind that asks nothing. Alexander's eyes drifted to the old Swiss watch at her wrist. "That watch," he said quietly. "It was in the photograph." Her hand stilled. For the first time since he had known her, Claire looked almost unguarded. "What photograph?" "Beirut. My father kept one." She said nothing, but her fingers closed over the watch as if touching memory itself. "Some doors," she whispered, "should open slowly." Then she moved away to greet a late-arriving guest, leaving Alexander alone with cooling coffee, old poetry, and a question that had stopped feeling like curiosity and begun to feel like fate. Outside, rain softened to mist. Inside, the billionaire who once used language as a game sat tracing Arabic letters by hand on a linen napkin like a schoolboy. And from the service station, unseen by him, Claire watched for a moment before lowering her eyes, as though she had just witnessed a man learning not a language, but the shape of listening. The photograph did not leave Alexander's mind. For 2 days he carried its ghost through boardrooms and elevators, hearing Claire's voice beneath the noise of quarterly projections. Some doors should open slowly. No one had spoken to him in riddles since his father died. Yet somehow her silences felt more precise than the speeches. Of men paid millions to advise him. On Friday evening he arrived earlier than usual, but Claire was not on the floor. Another waitress poured his coffee. It tasted ordinary. He did not touch it. At 7:20, the maitre d' approached. "Miss Whitmore is in the private library room." She asked if he would join her after service. Alexander stared, almost certain he had misheard. She asked. Not permitted. Not tolerated. Asked. The private library at Marlowe House had once been a cigar room for old banking families. Mahogany walls. Leather chairs. A grand piano no one played. At 9:15, Claire entered carrying no order pad, no tray, only the old leather poetry book under one arm. Without the apron, in a simple ivory blouse and dark skirt, she looked less transformed than revealed. Alexander rose instinctively. He had not realized until then he had begun standing when she approached. Claire noticed, said nothing. She placed the book on the table between them. Beside it, a folded document. "What is this?" he asked. "A translation your attorneys missed." He opened it. His pulse shifted. It was not about the Riyadh deal. It was an old charitable trust established decades earlier by his father in Beirut, dormant and forgotten. One beneficiary name had been crossed out in faded ink and rewritten in Arabic. "How did you find this?" Claire sat opposite him for the first time in the story of their meetings. Equal height, equal silence. "Because your father once asked mine to help hide it." Alexander looked up sharply. The room seemed to lean inward. Rain whispered against leaded windows. "You knew my father." "I was 10. Her hand touched the Swiss watch. "He called me Little Princess as a joke because I corrected his Arabic grammar." For a moment Alexander did not move. The phrase from the first night echoed back with almost frightening symmetry. Then she slid a photograph across the table. Not the one from his cedar box. Another, clearer. His father younger, laughing beside a Middle Eastern scholar, and between them, a blonde child with solemn eyes wearing the same watch.
"Claire."
He exhaled as though something long held had finally left him. "Why tell me now?" "Because until now," she said quietly, "you would have treated this as an acquisition." The words should have stung. Instead, they landed as truth. Alexander leaned back, studying her as if seeing not a waitress, not a mystery, but the first witness to a forgotten part of his own family. "You could have used this for leverage." Claire almost smiled. "That assumes everyone bargains." The piano in the corner caught his eye. Dust over ivory keys. "Do you play?" he asked. She rose, walked to it, touched one note. A single warm tone drifted through the library. Then another. Not performance. Memory. Alexander watched her profile in lamplight and understood why some people never need to announce dignity. It gathers around them. When she returned, he pushed the trust document back toward her. "This belongs with you." Claire shook her head.
"No."
"It belongs where your father intended." He hesitated. "Then help me restore it." Her gaze held his for a long breath. This was no longer billionaire and waitress. Something had quietly shed those names. She reached for the fountain pen lying beside the papers, his father's old pen he had brought without knowing why, and placed it in his hand. "Then begin by signing for someone besides yourself." Alexander lowered the pen to paper. Outside, rain had stopped. And somewhere in the old library, beneath a silent piano and 2 untouched cups of coffee, a man accustomed to owning rooms had just been invited into one. The signature on the trust papers should have ended the evening, but it began something neither of them had named. In the weeks that followed, Alexander came to Marlowe House less as a patron and more as a man keeping an appointment with a quieter version of himself. Yet Claire changed the rhythm before he could grow comfortable. One Thursday, she did not serve his table. Another server brought his coffee and a folded check with a handwritten note. "Walk north 3 blocks at closing."
No signature.
He arrived at 11:45 beneath a pale February moon and found Claire waiting outside a narrow brownstone on East 63rd Street.
No markup.
Wool coat. The old Swiss watch catching streetlight. "You brought me here." "Without explanation," he said. "You used to do the same to shareholders," she replied, and for the first time he laughed without defense. Inside, the brownstone was not a home but a language center. Children sat around long wooden tables repeating phrases in Arabic and English from chalkboards. Refugee families. Volunteers. Shelves of donated books. The trust his father had created, Claire explained, had once funded language scholarships before disappearing into legal neglect. She had kept the place alive with tips and anonymous donors. Alexander stood motionless, absorbing what his empire's balance sheets had never shown him. A little boy tugged Claire's sleeve and handed her a worksheet. She crouched beside him, correcting script with the same quiet precision she once used over $1 billion contract. Alexander watched her and felt something almost humiliating in its tenderness. Not romance. Reverence. "You built this while serving tables?" he asked later as they stacked books. "I kept it breathing," she said. Building implies certainty. He glanced around the worn room, peeling paint softened by lamplight. And what would certainty do? Claire handed him a box of dictionaries. Probably ruin it. He carried the box upstairs.
Heavy.
Honest weight. The kind his hands were unaccustomed to. Near midnight, an old man entered, wrapped in a weathered overcoat. He greeted Claire in Arabic, then turned to Alexander with sudden recognition. "Hayes." The name sounded older in his accent. Claire looked between them. "Professor Hamden taught my father." The old scholar studied Alexander for a long moment. "Your father," once listened before he spoke. I wondered if the son had inherited anything difficult. Alexander did not know whether to smile. "I am trying." Hamden nodded toward Claire. "Then keep learning from the one who never stopped." The words landed deeper than praise. Weeks later, Alexander brought architects, not for luxury renovations but roof repairs, heating upgrades, better desks. Claire objected to marble, refused branded plaques, accepted only what served function. At one point, he proposed naming the center after her father. She shook her head.
Let
children give it a future before we give it a monument. Even his philanthropy, he realized, she kept rescuing from vanity. One snowy evening, while balancing accounts at a scarred oak table, Claire slid him a crumpled restaurant receipt from the night they met. She had kept it. On the back, in his hurried handwriting, was the Arabic phrase she made him practice weeks ago. "Respect enters where pride leaves." "You wrote this badly," she said. "I was arrogant then." "And now?" she asked. Alexander looked at the children's coats hanging by the door, the repaired radiator humming, her fingers resting beside the old Swiss watch. "Now I am careful." Claire did not answer. She only pushed a chipped coffee mug toward him, the same dark roast from Marlowe House. He lifted it and noticed she was using his father's fountain pen to grade homework. A small thing, yet he felt an odd tightening in his throat. Power had once announced itself through acquisitions, signatures, towers. Here it appeared in a borrowed pen, a warm radiator, a woman trusting him with unpaid bills. Outside, snow drifted against the windows. Inside, while children recited verbs in 2 languages, Alexander Hayes understood he was no longer being taught Arabic. He was being taught proportion. Spring came quietly to Manhattan, and with it came invitations Alexander Hayes had spent a lifetime accepting without thought. Charity galas, foundation dinners, diplomatic receptions where polished men measured one another through handshakes and watches. For the first time, he declined most of them, until one envelope arrived bearing the seal of an International Cultural Council, his father once advised. Claire looked at it across the oak table in the language center and said only, "You should go. Only if you come." She did not answer immediately. Her fingers rested over the old Swiss watch as if listening to time itself. "I do not belong in rooms built for inheritance." Alexander looked around the modest classroom, chipped mugs, stacked dictionaries, children's drawings curling on the walls. "Neither do I anymore." 2 nights later they entered the reception together, though not arm in arm, not announced.
simply
Walking beside one another beneath chandeliers brighter than Marlowe House. Claire wore a midnight blue dress, so simple it seemed almost severe.
no jewels.
Just the old watch at her wrist. Yet when Arabic diplomats began arriving, their expressions changed. One elderly ambassador froze upon hearing her greet him in an older Levantine dialect. Another bowed slightly before kissing her hand in old-world courtesy. Alexander saw it all with astonishment not born of jealousy, but revelation. He had once believed status was granted by rooms. Here he watched a room rearrange itself around quiet authority. During dinner, a young financier at Alexander's table, eager and careless, joked about how remarkable it was for a waitress to clean up so royally. The table laughed uncertainly. Alexander did not. He set down his glass. "She has taught more dignity," than most men in this room have practiced. Silence spread like ink in water. The financier reddened. Claire did not rescue the moment. She only lifted her eyes to Alexander, surprised not by his defense, but by its simplicity. No display, no speech, just a line drawn. Later, while an oud player performed beneath candlelight, Professor Hamden approached with folded documents. The Dormant Trust had been approved for international grants, funding enough to secure the language center for decades. Alexander looked ready to speak, but Claire touched the papers first. Read the sponsor line.
He did.
The grant was anonymous. No Hayes name. No Whitmore name. Only a phrase in Arabic. The House of Listening. He looked at her. You changed it. We changed it, she corrected. Yet the evening carried one final turn. An elderly princess in exile, frail but luminous, was wheeled toward Claire by attendants. She studied Claire's face for a long time before touching the old Swiss watch. Tears stood in her eyes. She spoke in Arabic too soft for most to hear. Alexander caught only one word.
Daughter.
Claire bent and kissed the woman's hand. No explanation followed. None needed. On the drive back through rain-washed streets, Alexander sat unusually silent. You never told me about her, he said. Claire watched city lights blur against the
Glass.
Some histories survive better when not displayed. He nodded slowly. Then, after a mile, I almost bought a restaurant to impress a woman who had already inherited something I could not purchase. Claire turned toward him. And what was that? Alexander looked out at the wet pavement reflecting traffic lights like scattered rubies. Grace under insult. She said nothing. But when the car stopped outside the language center, she left her hand for a moment on the leather seat before stepping out, as though pausing over a thought. Alexander noticed she had forgotten the old Swiss watch on the seat beside him. He picked it up and felt its faint warmth still there. Not forgotten, he realized.
Left.
Trust in the shape of a watch. That night, he did not return to his penthouse. He sat alone in the dark classroom while radiators clicked and children's alphabets covered the walls, turning the watch over in his palm until dawn. Somewhere between midnight and morning, a billionaire who once tested strangers for amusement understood he was now the one being entrusted with something far rarer than affection. Stewardship. Claire did not mention the watch the next day, nor the day after. It remained on Alexander's desk in its velvet box beside his father's fountain pen, two objects that now seemed to hold an argument about inheritance. He carried it with him for a week before returning to the language center one rainy Tuesday. Children were reciting verbs when Claire looked up and saw the watch in his hand. She said nothing, only dismissed the class early. When the room emptied, Alexander placed the watch on the oak table between them. You left this with me. Claire studied it but did not reach for it. Did I? You knew I would treat it as a question. A faint smile touched her mouth. And did you answer it? He opened the velvet box. The cracked leather strap had been replaced, not with exotic skin or gold links, but hand-stitched dark calfskin, simple and elegant. The face had been restored. Time moved again. Claire's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. You repaired it. No, he said. I respected it enough not to improve it. For a long moment, neither.
Moved.
Rain tapped softly against the windows. Then Claire took the watch, fastened it around her wrist, and whispered in Arabic, almost to herself. He would have approved. Your father? She nodded. He believed repair was nobler than replacement. That evening she surprised him. Come with me. They took a cab downtown to a riverside warehouse converted into an immigrant legal clinic the trust now quietly supported.
No gala.
No press. Just folding tables, coffee urns, tired families filling forms. Claire sat translating for an elderly widow from Damascus while Alexander helped organize paperwork, awkward at first, then attentive. At one point, a young volunteer mistook him for a donor dropping in for optics. You can leave the check with the front desk. Alexander looked at Claire across the room. She did not rescue him. He smiled. I am here to alphabetize. By midnight, stacks were sorted, forms translated, children asleep across chairs. As they stepped onto the East River promenade, wind moved off the water carrying salt and spring. Claire leaned on the railing. Do you know why I left the watch? Because you trust me. Partly. She looked toward the bridge lights. Because I needed to know whether you would return history polished into a trophy or restored into memory. Alexander turned that over in silence. And she met his gaze. You returned memory. He should have answered with something polished, something worthy. Instead he said only, you have made me clumsy in the best ways. Claire laughed softly, a sound so rare it startled him more than the first Arabic phrase had. Then her expression quieted. There is something you still do not know. From her coat pocket she drew an envelope, edges worn. A letter in his father's hand. Unsent. Addressed to Alexander at age 16. He stared. Why do you have this? My father kept it. He said one day the son might be ready for what the father could not say aloud. Alexander opened it beneath the river lights. Only one line was underlined. Learn from those whom power overlooks. His throat tightened. He folded the letter carefully, unable to speak. Claire watched him not with pity, but recognition. He was trying to tell you before he died. Alexander slipped the letter beside the fountain pen in his coat pocket. And you have been finishing the sentence ever since. She did not deny it. A fairy horn echoed over Blackwater. They stood in silence, shoulder to shoulder but not touching, while city lights trembled in the river. Then Claire extended her hand, palm upward. He frowned. What? Your cufflinks. Why? You do not need armor here. He removed the gold cufflinks his board once called his signature and placed them in her hand. She closed her fingers around them, then slipped them into her coat, without ceremony. Such a small gesture. Yet Alexander felt as though something old had been set down for good. Walking back along the promenade, he noticed he had matched his stride to hers without thinking. And somewhere between the river wind and the letter in his pocket, he began to sense the ending approaching, not as loss, but as a silence waiting to be earned. Summer settled over the city with long gold evenings, and Marlowe House reopened its terrace after renovation. On the first night of June, Alexander arrived without reservation and found his usual corner table occupied by strangers. For a moment he stood uncertain, a sensation once foreign to him. Then the maitre d' handed him a folded receipt. Same handwriting. Roof garden. He climbed the narrow service stair to the rooftop herb garden the restaurant used for garnishes. Claire stood beside rows of rosemary and basil, sleeves rolled to her elbows, pouring coffee into two plain ceramic cups.
No cristal.
No silver. Just wind moving through potted lavender and the skyline burning amber beyond the Hudson. You brought me to the roof, Alexander said. You once tried to buy the whole building, she answered. This seemed cheaper. He smiled, but something in her tone carried farewell. He felt it before he understood it. They sat on a wooden bench weathered gray by rain. Between them lay his father's fountain pen, the unsent letter, and the gold cufflinks she returned wrapped in linen. I kept these long enough, she said. Why give them back? Because they are no longer armor. Below them, traffic hummed. Like distant surf. Claire unfolded a new set of architectural sketches. Not for Manhattan. A smaller language school near the coast in Maine, where refugee families had begun resettling. You are leaving, Alexander said. Not accusation. Recognition. The center can breathe now. It does not need me every day. He looked at the ocean blue lines on the paper and understood the quiet cruelty of genuine freedom. It does not ask permission. For several minutes, neither spoke. Then Claire lifted one sketch. There is a library room here. She pointed. With a piano. Alexander traced the outline. And who will restore the roof when it leaks? Perhaps a billionaire who finally learned how to use a hammer. He laughed, but his eyes did not. The light softened. Somewhere below, glasses clinked from dinner service. Claire reached into her bag and placed a folded restaurant bill between them. The very first one from the night he mocked her with Arabic. On the back she had written his opening challenge in careful script, and beneath it his later translation in steadier handwriting. Two versions of the same man. Why keep this, he asked. To remember where pride sounded loudest. He looked at the old receipt, then at her watch catching sunset. And where did it go? Claire glanced toward the skyline. It learned to lower its voice. A breeze lifted a strand of her hair. Without thinking, Alexander reached, then stopped halfway. She noticed, said nothing. Instead, she slid one of the ceramic cups toward him, the rim faintly chipped. Translate something for me. She spoke in Arabic, slow and old-fashioned, the dialect from that first impossible evening. He listened, repeated it carefully, no longer self-conscious. She closed her eyes, as if hearing an echo fulfilled. What did I say? He asked. Claire answered in English. When respect arrives, ownership becomes unnecessary. He stared into the coffee, then quietly removed his signet ring, the one every board member associated with Hayes Capital, and placed it beside the cup. Take this to Maine, he said, for the library door.
Claire pushed it back. No symbols.
Then melt it. She studied him for a long moment and something almost like sorrow warmed into approval.
Dusk deepened.
The city lights came on one by one. At last Claire stood. Walk me downstairs. They descended through the empty dining room after closing. Chairs upturned on tables. Floor lamps dimmed. At the door she stopped beside the old open sign, touched it, then turned it to closed. A tiny click. Ordinary. Final. Alexander thought she would leave then. Instead she looked at him and said in careful English, as if translating from somewhere older, Come to Maine when the first rain reaches the library roof. She stepped into the summer night. After a few paces she did not turn back, only lifted one hand slightly, almost imperceptibly, the gesture of someone who trusts what follows silence. Alexander remained in the doorway, holding the untouched coffee cup she had forgotten on purpose. It was still warm, and in that warmth, before any goodbye had been spoken, he understood the story was already moving toward its quietest truth. The first rain reached Maine in late September. It began before dawn, a soft percussion against cedar shingles, the kind of rain that did not arrive with drama but with memory. Alexander stood beneath the unfinished library roof, holding a ladder steady while a local carpenter adjusted flashing along the eaves.
His suit was gone.
Rolled sleeves. Work boots, still too new. On a nearby windowsill sat a chipped ceramic cup he recognized from the rooftop in Manhattan. Claire had placed it there the day he arrived and never mentioned it. By noon the rain thinned to silver mist. Children's voices drifted from the next room where Arabic and English moved together in small bright repetitions. Alexander climbed down from the ladder and found Claire sorting donated books across a pine table. The old Swiss watch rested at her wrist, ticking softly in the hush between pages. Without a word he reached into his coat and set something beside her hand. The gold cufflinks, melted and recast into two simple brass door pulls for the library card catalog. Claire touched them once with her fingertips, then opened the top drawer and slid in the first handwritten catalog card.
No pras. No surprise.
Only a look that lingered half a breath longer than usual. Weeks passed. Leaves turned copper. The roof held. Alexander came and went between New York and Maine, though less and less seemed to pull him south. One evening after the children left, Claire brewed coffee and placed 2 cups by the window overlooking dark pines. Rain tapped lightly again.
Familiar.
Alexander removed his father's fountain pen from his pocket and laid it beside the chipped cup. Its ink had finally run dry. Claire uncapped it, filled it from a small bottle, and returned it to him as naturally as passing bread.
Such a small act.
Yet he felt the old ache of unfinished things settle into peace. Outside, wind moved through the trees. Inside, neither spoke for a long while. Then Claire rose, crossed to the library door, and adjusted the brass handle made from his former cufflinks. It caught lamplight in a quiet arc. She opened the door for the last child leaving and paused with her hand on the frame. Alexander watched the gesture more than the door itself. How lightly she touched what she cared for. When she returned, she set before him a folded receipt, yellowed at the edges. The first one. He thought he knew every mark on it. But beneath the old Arabic phrase, she had added a final line in her careful hand. He read it aloud, slowly in Arabic first, then English. The highest form of honor is to leave another person more themselves. He looked up.
Claire was not watching him.
She was watching rain gather on the glass. He folded the receipt once, the way she used to fold bills in Marlowe House, and slipped it inside his father's pen case. Then, almost absent-mindedly, he moved his coffee cup an inch toward hers until the porcelain rims touched with the faintest sound. Claire glanced down at the two cups, then at him.
No smile.
Just the softening of someone who has nothing left to defend. At closing, she turned the library sign from open to closed. The same tiny click as the restaurant door months before. But this time she left the key in the lock. Alexander noticed. She walked toward the window, stopped, and without looking back spoke one sentence in Arabic. He answered in the same language, carefully, without needing correction. Her shoulders eased. That was all. Later, after she had gone upstairs, Alexander remained alone in the lamp-lit library. He straightened a child's misplaced dictionary, closed a drawer by its brass pull, and touched the warm rim of the cup she had left unfinished. Outside, rain moved across the roof he had come to repair. He listened to it a long time. Then he turned off the lights, leaving only the window glow over shelves of translated worlds. Before going upstairs, he looked once at the door Claire had left unlocked. Some doors, he thought, open slowly. Some stay open because no one tries to own the threshold. And in the hush after the latch settled, the room seemed to offer its own quiet moral. True grace is not in being answered like royalty, but in learning to answer life with reverence.